Okay, so we're here in Pixlr Editor, and we're going to be looking at how to create images using a complex image editor which has layers. Okay, so we're going to start out by creating a new image. On the new image dialog, we can give our image a name, which we're going to call sample, and we can make it transparent. And transparent just means, it doesn't have a colored background or a white background. It just has a transparent background. We'll see what that means in just a second. So we go ahead and click OK. And so if you've never used an image editor before, this checkered pattern that we see here, that is the transparent color. So basically, when you see this checkered pattern, that means it's transparent. So let's take a look at the screen. At the top, we have our standard Windows standard menuing system. We also have our toolbar, which is kind of standard for image editors. We also have our history, layers, and navigator. So the navigator is just the way for us to interact with the zooming. It's also a way for us to see everything that's on the screen at one time, even if it goes outside of what we can see in our main image window here with sample. Then we have our layers, and we're going to see what that means in just a second here. Okay, so the first tool that we're going to use, we're going to take a look at these drawing tools right here. We kind of have our standard pencil tool. So notice when I highlight a tool in the tools panel, we see the tool and then we see the options for the tool in the bar at the top. So our pencil tool we have here, you'll notice that it says sketchy. I can change that to trail. I can change it to sticky. So you'll notice that we have different, each of the different options there under pencil. I can also change the size, obviously. Okay. I can also change the opacity. So let's say we change the opacity to 50%. So opacity means how much you can see through a particular thing. So this box down here, so we change the opacity to 50, and then we can change the foreground color. So this color right here is going to change our pencil to red. So notice that now as I go over, I can see the lines beneath the line that I'm drawing, and that's the opacity. Okay. So obviously the opacity could go further down. It could go down to 20, right? And I can even see the line less. And then if we raise it back up to 100, obviously if we go over, we can't see anything below the lines. Okay. The paintbrush is very similar to the pencil. The main difference being that you can change the head on the paintbrush. So, for example, if I change it to star, notice that we can change the diameter for the star, the spacing, the hardness. So that's an example of that. So if I click this thing, this brush with the paintbrush, notice that I've changed the hardness to 100. I get a very hard line. If I change the hardness to 45, I get a softer shape. And if I click and drag, if I hold down the mouse, click and drag, or the mouse button and drag, I get it will just continuously give me that color. I can also do things like scatter. That means that when I'm dragging, it'll kind of throw things all over the place like that, still in the same tip that I'm using. Okay, so that's the pencil and the brush. The next thing we're going to look at is the eraser, which works also just exactly how you might think it is. The interesting with the eraser is you can actually use it. It uses the same brush idea here with the diameter, hardness, and spacing. So with this, we can, if the opacity is 100 right now, we can also change the opacity of the eraser. So the eraser itself can be less than 100%. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and erase everything out here since we have our eraser going. Okay, so next we have the fill, and fill can be used in a couple of different ways. So let's go down to our shape tool here, and we click the shape tool. Notice that the Options for the shape tool are a rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, and line. So line would be a straight line, right? And so let's not fill in the shape. So this color that we're selecting down here, the foreground color, is going to be the shape of the outline in this case. And the border size, that's going to be the shape of the border around the shape. So you can go ahead and create a blue rectangle there. Now if we want to, we can go ahead and fill in that shape. So notice that we can use the fill bucket to fill in a shape that we've drawn. Okay, so let's try that again there. We try a circle. This time let's make a red circle. Let's make the border slightly larger. Oops. Okay, so let's make the border slightly larger. Then we can go back in and we can actually fill in that shape. So we can fill in the circle using the paint bucket. Okay, so that brings us to the next one is how, well, if we can fill in a circle, right, or a shape, can we also fill in just a selection? Okay, so if we look at this marquee tool here, notice that this marquee is how that I can click and drag. Notice the marquee selection. So if this marquee tool, I can do a rectangle, I can do a circle. I can also feather it, which is interesting. We'll take a look at that in a minute. So if I want to do just a hard cutout, right, I can make this and I can hit the delete key, or I can edit cut. Okay, so edit cut, and it creates this kind of cutout shape, right? Make this a little bit bigger. I can also change this to feather. So feathering really does help in some cases. This is the number of pixels that are going to be all the way from completely transparent to completely opaque on the side. So let's just take a look at that. So if I feather it and I hit whoops, edit cut. Okay, notice that I get this kind of fuzzy effect on the sides, right? And that will allow something that's in the background to show through. So let's take a look at how I would, so as I'm drawing this, notice that this all acts as one thing, right? So if I add additional stuff on here, so say I go back to the shape tool, now I'm going to make a rounded rectangle. Notice that in the rounded rectangle, basically we can change the border size, we can change the radius of the sides of the shape. So let's take a look at that radius there. So the radius, notice that how rounded the sides are. If I increase this radius up to 100, notice it gets much more round, right? Okay. Let's say that I want to change the fill color. Let's take a look at this, the color selection here. So the color selection, there are actually 3 ways to select the color. Image means all the different colors that are already contained in the image I'm working on. Web, these are kind of the old school web safe colors. So back a long time ago, you could only use certain colors on the internet, which seems very odd now, but there was a limit on the amount of colors you could use. RGB is basically taking the red, green, and blue up to a certain point, and notice that in the center there, that's the combination of all of them, right? So this color selector is actually pretty nice, and then you just kind of move this dot. Actually, don't move the dot, do you? Just move the sliders, and then this area right here is your final color, and then of course you have the HSL right here. Which is the one that's probably the easiest one to use. So in this case, you kind of select, using the outside circle, you select the color, the kind of color that you want to use, and then on the inside square, we select all the way from white to black, and from black over to the color that's actually in the wheel up here. So you can get a very fine selection of color. Go ahead and click OK. Okay, so we go ahead and use the ellipse tool. Notice that if I make a circle here, an ellipse, if I hold down the shift key, whoops, actually not the shift key in this case, if I go to, it does not allow me to do aspect ratio. Okay, so that's kind of our basic shape tools here. Let's go ahead and do a stamp. Okay, the clone tool. The clone tool is pretty interesting. So basically all we do is we hold down the control key and click. Then, so when I just clicked right there, I set the sampling space. So watch what's going to happen. Now I click and drag, and you see my mouse is on the upper right hand area, the cursor in the upper right hand area, and then the lower left hand is the area to be cloning. And notice that as I drag across there, whatever's in the clone area is exactly what shows in my cursor area. So I'm actually cloning sections of this of the drawing in another spot. So you'll notice there, as I clone, I can recreate parts of a picture somewhere else. This is used mainly in photographs. So say if I wanted to, say I have a piece of a fabric that's missing, or maybe plants that are missing, something that's a complicated pattern, basically I can clone those pixels somewhere else to add that stuff somewhere else in the photograph. It's very, very, very useful. Okay, so that's the clone tool. And then finally, let's take a look at the gradient tool. So the gradient actually is a filler which works kind of in an interesting way. So what we have here is, to use the gradient tool, you really need to make a selection, and that's this marquee tool. So let's say that we have this marquee, and it's our selection tool. We can leave the marquee up, then select the gradient. We click and drag the gradient across, and that will fill in the selection. And notice that the feathering of the marquee actually works to feather the tool. Okay, so I just did that. So basically, I took the marquee, I clicked and dragged, so I had a selection. I filled it with a gradient by clicking, drag, mouse down, move the mouse, let go of the mouse, and so that filled it in. It allowed me to move this around kind of, but once I unselect it, it gets set permanently. Okay, so here is the problem, right? Here's the problem with most uncomplicated drawing programs that you probably used before, is that I can draw over things, but it becomes this one big mass of pixels, right? That I can't really edit very well. And so this is where layers come in. Okay, so let's go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and delete, or not delete, I'm going to actually add a layer. So if we see in the layers toolbar right here, I'm going to go to add layer. That's this little piece of paper looking thing. I'm going to go back down to layer 0. I'm actually going to trash that layer. Okay, so I'm going to put delete layer. And now let's go ahead and draw a shape here. So I take a shape. Notice that it's going to be a blue circle with a border size of 9, and it's going to be filled black. Okay, so that's my first shape. Now let's go ahead, and the technique that we're going to use when we make things in a drawing program like this is we're going to put every element on a separate layer. So we're going to go ahead and click New Layer, and if I want to put another element on, like another shape or something like that, I just create a new layer, and I put that element on the next layer. So let's say that we're going to do red border, and we're going to fill it with yellow here. Okay, so I click, drag, or click, mouse down, drag, let go, and here's my next shape. Now here is where it is really helpful to have layers. So notice that the black circle and the yellow rounded rectangle are on two separate layers. Now what I can do is I can actually move these separately. They're not attached, right? So it's almost as if there's two pieces of clear plastic laying on top of each other, and I can interact with each of those as if they are their own separate drawing. And this is really the power of a layer-based editor like this. So it remains editable, right? So for example, if I want to put text in, I want to put hello. Okay, I can take that text and notice that when I put the text in, I can change the color of the text. I can make it bold. I can change the font. Let's make it impact, because impact is obviously the greatest. We don't have to make it impact. Okay, go. Okay, so that hello, notice that hello becomes its own layer. Okay, so I can move this text around, right? It's not stuck to the other object. So that's this idea of layers here. So let's go ahead and add a layer, and the last thing we're going to do is that we're going to actually take a look at creating a gradient that is a little bit more complicated. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create with this lasso. Now this is kind of the freehand version of selection here. We're not going to, well, we're actually going to feather it by 1 pixel. In general, you would almost never have just a hard selection, a hard marquee. You would almost always want to feather it, or at least anti-alias it. So I click. Notice that the straight line lasso, I have to click each time there's a point, and then I double click to close the marquee. On a freehand marquee, I just go ahead and click and drag, and the marquee is created as I drag, and then when I let go, it creates the actual marquee. So notice this dotted, kind of moving dotted line here is the marquee. That's the selection area. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the gradient tool. So let's take a look at this gradient, how I create or I define this gradient. So I click in the gradient, I click the gradient. Now the gradient is defined by these boxes. So we have a white box here and a black box here for now to start out with. So I can do a couple of things on this box. So once I click this box, now I'm interacting. So I just click this white box. Now I'm interacting with this box. So I can change the opacity. Let's change the opacity to 0. I'm going to change the color to red. Okay. Now notice that I can see this checkerboard pattern that's inside the gradient, right? And now I'm going to go over to the other box. I can actually move this box over. So see, I can actually move the gradient where that is defined. Let's say I want to now, because I've clicked this black box. Now I'm interacting with it. Let's make it blue. Okay, so notice that its opacity is 100. Let's make that 50%. Let's kind of move it over. And I can add boxes. So let's go ahead and click over here, and now I can actually interact. I can make as many boxes as I want. So I can actually, click this first gray box. I can change its color to red, or to, let's say, green this time. Click OK, and then I can move this box over, and let's say I want to fade it back to green, but this time I want to make the opacity less, like 50%. Notice that when I add a box in this one, in this particular editor, it always starts out with gray, which is actually kind of difficult, mainly because of the fact that it should add a box. It should add these boxes as the current color at that point in the gradient, but it doesn't. So we'll just work around it. Okay, so that is our gradient for the time being. So we define this kind of wacky gradient here. The type is linear, right? Okay, radial means that it kind of expands out from a central point. Okay, so let's say that I do the gradient like this. Okay, notice that's the radial gradient, right? So we have the center going out to the green, so it basically goes from the center out, all right? If I do linear, on the other hand, okay, notice that it starts from the point where I first click, and then it goes out from that point. So I click on one side of the marquee, bring it over, and I can get this kind of gradient effect. So now once I click off, of course, this is on a layer, so I can move it around, right? So notice that my gradient can show through to the other items below it. Okay, so that is those are the drawing tools in Pixlr. So we covered the drawing tools and the idea of layers in Pixlr. Good luck.